You've been told your whole life that debt is bad, but what if that's the same advice that's keeping you broke? Because some of the richest people in New Zealand have used debt to get even richer. So in this episode of the Property Academy podcast, you're going to learn how to use debt the right way to get ahead, including some examples of people who have made hundreds of millions of dollars using debt, good debt versus bad debt, what's the actual difference, and the biggest risks of debt that you can't ignore. Now, Andrew, a lot of people think that debt is bad and that if you're rich, then you shouldn't have any debt.
Yeah, I think about kind of when I was young, and I absolutely thought debt was scary and it was bad. And it probably comes from the fact that my parents really struggled with debt. Like they had a mortgage, which, nowadays is a small mortgage, but certainly for them that was huge at the time. And worrying about money and not being able to pay that mortgage when dad got made redundant, or just if they didn't have enough money to support the family, and then thinking about, well, what does that mean? If I don't pay my mortgage, the bank will come in and they'll sell my house, and then we won't have anywhere to live. That's horrible and quite stressful. So as a result, people then associate the debt as being bad when it's not necessarily the debt that's bad, but certainly the financial pressure that can come with debt, that can be bad.
And so what was it like the first time, because you've taken on a lot of debt in your life, but what was it like the first time you took on debt when you were 19 years old buying your first investment property?
So I was 19 and I took out on a couple of $100,000 mortgage. It was 95% of the purchase price of my first rental property. And I remember doing the numbers on it. I actually did this the other day in preparation for this podcast. I worked out what my mortgage payments would be on, I think I said $200K mortgage. I said 7% interest rate because that was probably about right at the time, on a 25-year loan term, because they didn't do 30-year loan terms back then, or generally speaking. And it was principal and interest because I was borrowing 95%. And it worked out to be $330 a week. And I remember thinking when I did this the other day, oh, that's pretty manageable, right? That's not my top up. That's my full mortgage payment. And then I worked out, oh, hang on a minute. My income was probably $37,500. So that $330 a week, that represented 50% on my gross annual salary, right? So if you take my salary and say 25% goes to tax, 50% goes to my mortgage now, and then I've only got 25% to live on, that's quite a scary concept when I'm thinking about, okay, well, if I don't have a tenant, I also won't have any money by the time I pay all my bills.
And certainly I've been in situations where, my debt has really held me back. When I was 23 years old, 24 years old, I had credit card debt, I had student loans, I had car loans, and you see your money going back to the lender and you think about all of the debt payments you are making every single week, and it might be a couple of $100 here and $50 here to that specific loan. And then, you don't even want to think about your student loan because sometimes they're so large. And I think you often think, oh man, I can't wait to get out of debt because then I'm going to have more money for myself. And so how do rich people though use debt to get richer?
I think the biggest difference between rich and poor people and how they use debt is that poor people will use debt to buy depreciating assets. So what I remember that, they go and buy a 20 grand car and they put it on tick, right? And then 10 years later, that car might be worth $10,000, $5,000, but you took out a $20,000 loan, and depending on the deposit situation and how quickly you're paying it back, it might be that you've still got a $10,000 loan, but you got a $5,000 asset attached to it. So you're upside down.
And then on total of that, you've paid 20 grand, right? You've paid all of this interest, you've paid all this loan back, but your assets actually gone down in value. Now, how does that compare to people who are rich and use debt?
So rich people use debt to buy appreciating assets, so things that are going to go up in value. So we talk about property all the time on the show, but also like businesses. So imagine you borrow all or most of the money and you buy an asset like a business or a property, and that property or business goes up in value. It goes from, say, $500,000 to $1 million over the course of 15 years. Okay, but you borrowed $500,000 to do it, but now it's worth $1 million. Well, you've just made $500,000 and you might not have put any money in at the start, or if you put in a 20% deposit, you put in 100 grand, but now you've made an extra 500 grand.
Yeah, and end up with 600. So typically I do see that poor people use debt to buy things that go down in value, whereas rich people use debt and buy things that go up in value. And this kind of comes into that idea of good debt versus bad debt. If I think about good debt, which is when you buy something or you use the debt to buy something that's going to go up in value. I think education's an example of that. You go to university, typically you're going to earn more money because of that. Even if you went into debt in order to go to university, that can still be a financial decision that puts you ahead. Or assets like business or property, even depending on how old you are, potentially a laptop if it's for work because it's going to get you ahead, even if you put it on debt. Whereas if I think about bad debt, it's typically going to be cars most of the time, unless you're borrowing money to buy a cheap car to get yourself to work. Maybe credit card debt, or holidays is the other one people borrow money for to go on holiday, and then you're still paying for that many, many years later. And it's actually amazing how often you see that rich people use debt to get ahead. One of my favorite examples that I always talk about on YouTube and on the podcast is Graham Hart, which is actually New Zealand's second richest man now, right? And so he was all about the leveraged buyout, which basically means you buy a business, and we're going to make the numbers up here, for $1 billion you buy this business for, you put in 100 mil of your own money, you borrow the other 900 mil, which is a lot of debt. You set about doubling the value of the business, which, think of that as renovating a house, right?
Real good renovation.
And so we're going to change up the size of the organization. We're going to put more money into marketing. We're going to change things on the balance sheet. And now the business is worth $2 billion, but you've still got the $900 million of debt. So you've taken your $100 million and now you've 11x that, and you've got $1.1 billion. Now, I've made up all of those numbers as a bit of an example to see how this actually works. And actually, just as we were preparing for this podcast, I pulled out another one of my favorite biographies of New Zealand business people. I love biographies. Serious Fun.
Who's that?
It's Alan Gibbs.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Alan Gibbs made a shed load of money back when telecom was first privatised, so it was sold out of government ownership. So he teams up with three New Zealanders, which is a guy called Michael Fay, now Sir Michael Fay, David Richwright, and I think it was Trevor Farmer, and then Alan Gibbs. And they ended up putting together a deal where it was a major overseas company was going to buy 90% of telecom, and they'd buy the other 10% for about $400 million. Now, they made a deal with this overseas company where they didn't have to pay most of that $400 million until 3 years later. So they put in, I think, about 5% of that, which is obviously still a lot of money, about $20 million, but they ended up getting $400 million worth of shares straight away.
So they got the shares right away.
They got the shares straight away. They didn't have to pay for it.
Pay later.
Buy now, pay later. Didn't have to pay for it for 3 years. They go about doubling the value of the company, and by the time they had to pay for the shares 3 years later, they had the same amount of debt, but the shares had doubled in value, roughly, and so they sold half of them, paid back the loan.
Free shares.
And then they got about, what would it have been, I suppose, 400 between all of them, $400 million worth of shares, effectively for free, in quotation marks.
So you say, and we think about something like that. I mean, if you're the international company and these guys are going to go and work hard to double the value of your business, you still have 90% of that business. What a great deal for everyone.
Now, in that case, some of the shares were sold at different times and they all exited at different times. But it's a great read to see how it was actually done at the time. And the good news of the matter is that pretty early on, those shares became publicly available. So any New Zealander could have purchased telecom shares at that lower value before it massively increased. Now, because the value massively increased after the fact, some people do think that telecom was sold for way too cheaply and the New Zealand government did a bad deal. We're not here to argue about that. We're just here to say this is an example of some very successful people who use debt to get ahead. And I suppose this is kind of like a money in versus money out principle, right?
Yeah, I always think you don't just want to look at how quickly the property or the business goes up in value or whether or not it doesn't. You want to look at how much money you put in and how much money you get out. So say you buy, again, a $500,000 business or property and you put $100,000 deposit in and then it doubles in value to $1 million. Well, you've made your $500,000, but you only put in $100,000 to do that. So you get back your $100,000 plus the $500,000 that you've made. So you're getting a 5 times return on your money. Now that's money in, money out. That's what I look at, which is effectively return on investment, which is my favorite way to analyze any potential returns that I'm going to get on property, but also anything. I want to know what's it going to cost me to get X amount of return? And I know it's a bit of guesswork what the return's going to be over time, but you always want to bring it down to that. Investing is kind of, once you get beyond the risks and you're comfortable with everything, it really comes down to that. What am I putting in? What am I getting out?
And previously, that return on investment, money in versus money out, has been really difficult to calculate because there are lots of different ways, especially in property, that you are able to get a return. It could be from the cash flow or the property going up in value or doing a renovation or buying the property under value or paying down debt as well. There are kind of 4 ways to make money. And so that is the reason why we created a piece of software. It's called Opus Plus, where you can create your free account and create and run the numbers, create the return on investment analysis for any property in New Zealand. And look, I'll put a link for that down in the show notes just for anybody who wants to sign up for that. The other thing I just want to mention, Andrew, is obviously we've given some examples of very, very rich people who have made money using debt in business. And obviously you and I use money in property. And I just want to make sure that we're not saying that all you have to do is buy a property and all of a sudden you're Alan Gibbs worth $400 million and can invest a lot of money in sculptures, which is what he likes to do. But we're talking about the principle and showing how it works in different ways. It's not like if you buy 1 or 2 properties, all of a sudden you're like Sir Michael Fay, who I think last time I checked is worth something like $900 million. These are different asset classes, but it is an example of the same principle, looking at the money you put in versus the money that you potentially get out. Now, if you are going to invest and make money this way, you've got to be pretty comfortable with the debt and potentially change some of those mindsets that you might have had when you were a kid. So how does somebody start getting more comfortable with debt?
Yeah, because you need to remember debt equals risk. Like, there is risk when you take on debt. So my advice would be to start small and then build up over time. So don't start by borrowing $900 million. Good luck doing that anyway. You're not going to do that to buy $1 billion business today. When I think back to when I bought my first property, like that was an entry-level property, and I bought it. I scraped together the money to make it work. I put in my money for the renovations and then made a bit more money, got a bit more comfortable. And then I begin to trust the process a bit more. Now, looking back now, when as I said before, the $300 a week, $330 a week, that seems insignificant to me now. But it was scary enough that I didn't go crazy and then implode in the GFC or implode in the Christchurch earthquakes or implode in the COVID times, because my debt levels have been high for most people, but manageable for me. And that's probably one of the key lessons. You don't want to get to a point where you overextend or over leverage to such an extent that something outside of your control, COVID, earthquakes, interest rate hikes, interest deductibility, one of those things comes out and wipes you out.
And when Andrew says my advice is to start small and go up bigger, obviously Andrew's a financial advisor, so that's not his formal financial advice to you listening to this. This is his general take, as opposed to, yes, you, Ben, listening to this. This is our advice for you. And the other thing that you can do is just get comfortable with the math of it. I mean, one of the property investors' greatest friends is inflation. And that's because as the value of money erodes because the price of things goes up, so $1 doesn't buy as much stuff, the real inflation-adjusted value of that debt also goes down. And so often, one of the ways I think about it is if you see a 7% inflation rate, yes, your interest rate's probably high, but that means that the value of your debt has also gone down in real inflation-adjusted returns. Now, for some people, you'll think, I don't understand what that means. Other people will say, oh, that's wonderful. But getting comfortable with the maths of debt and how it changes over time, whether you think about the real value of it or you just think about it paying down. Now, there are some real risks and downsides, though, of taking on a lot of debt, right? And you've taken on quite a lot of it over time. Have you ever got close to financial ruin or failure? Because I think that's the main risk that people worry about.
I think that the only way you can get to that point is if you can't afford to make your mortgage commitments. And for me, I've borrowed predominantly for investing, right? So there's always a revenue stream, not just debt sitting there that has to be serviced by me only, with the exception of my own house. And I think, again, as time's gone on, I've always managed my debt levels at a relatively conservative number. Maybe not conservative for a lot of people listening, but at a conservative number for me. And because there's always been tenant income come in, I've been okay. The earthquakes were probably the most scary time because some houses weren't able to be lived in at that stage, or people were leaving the city. And that was probably the most nail-biting time for me, but got through that.
But if you think about those two biggest risks, obviously the biggest one is, like you said, you can't make your mortgage payments. And if you default on your mortgage, and maybe you've got several with the same bank, they start selling up your properties and you lose control pretty quickly. So the biggest risk is really around either losing your tenants or your own personal income, which means that, oh gosh, I'm not able to make those payments. I no longer have those assets. And I think the other biggest downside is that you can't control your biggest cost, which typically is your interest rate. Over the last few years, interest rates have gone up a lot, and it's completely outside your personal control about whether interest rates go up or down. You have some control over how long you fix for, but if you think that your interest rate might have tripled, your rent probably hasn't tripled, and neither has your income over that same time. And so that can eat up a lot of your disposable cash. But I don't think that we're saying that everybody should go out and take on millions and millions of dollars of debt.
No, yeah, definitely not. In fact, just someone I met yesterday, I looked at their numbers for them. They're a wee way off retirement, but they've been putting aggressively into an Australian super, or both of them been putting into Australian super, like 12%. They're going to have about $2 million at retirement. That's the number that they need to have for the income, that the lifestyle that they want. They don't need to take on any debt at all. They don't have to do anything. Now, in their instance, what they've said is, we don't want to be tied to our super, our Australian super. What if it changed? What if we decide to move to New Zealand? What if we just want to work a little bit less later on in life and all of a sudden we don't have the 12% is on half of our income? They're still going to carry on investing and they're going to accept a certain amount of debt, but everyone's different in terms of the level of debt that they need to take on to get to where they want to be. So you've got to get comfortable with what your goal is and then what you're willing to sacrifice and risk to get that goal.
So debt is not naturally good or evil, it's a tool that you can use. And some people will use debt and get crushed by it, while others will use it to build wealth. But it comes down to how you use it and what you buy with that debt. And if you found this useful, you've got to check out this next one about how this investor owns 43 properties but wish he'd learned this sooner. He breaks down the exact stages, lessons and mistakes that he made along the way. Click here to watch it now.